Dad, I missed yours. I just realized at the end of my prayer. Well, Romans 13:14, I'll just read it. Verse going back to 12, the night is far spent, the day is at hand. Let us therefore cast off the works of darkness. Let us put on the armor of light. Let us walk honestly as in the day, not in rioting and drunkenness, not in chambering and wantonness, not in strife and envying, but instead of laying the stone tablets of the 10 Commandments before us, Paul says, but put you on the Lord Jesus Christ, and make not provision for the flesh to fulfill the lusts thereof. So the goal of this series we're doing in Sunday school is to remind ourselves that with a view of Christ, we are motivated to live a more disciplined Christian life. And as we see the beauty of the spiritual discipline of Jesus' life, don't you find that as a believer with the Holy Spirit and the new man inside of you, it's not, oh boy, I got to follow that example. This is going to be rough. Instead, it's that this is a joy to be able to know that because I'm in Christ, I have the opportunity to follow his pattern. And I desire nothing more than to be like him. But the great encouragement is that New Testament principle that as we gaze upon him, we are changed into his image. So as we look at Jesus in this backshot, this background that we start each Sunday school with there in the wilderness, whatever the lusts of the flesh are that are most prevalent in our lives, at looking at Jesus and his self-denial, it can help us shed off the practice of yielding to the flesh. So we're looking at the spiritual disciplines of Christ. We're purposely leaving application each week for the group to figure out, and I'm trying not to teach on application so much so that we can just focus on what Christ did, not even what he taught, but what he practiced. That's our goal. So we've seen some different disciplines in his life. The first we saw was the discipline of Bible study that was more evident by his use of the word than by scriptures that said he went off and read his Bible. Which, by the way, is very important in our Christian lives. Before you have your 5-hour devotional time each day, you might ask yourself, am I doing anything with the word to bless others? And that can help remind us that our Bible time has a purpose, and that can actually determine how it's done, how long it is, when. It has a purpose of blessing others. And of course, knowing the word. Second discipline we saw was prayer. This one wasn't so hard to find, right? Found it all through the Gospels, all sorts of different passages about how Jesus prayed and his discipline. If Jesus was disciplined, one of the areas that's really obvious was prayer. And maybe one of the things that happens as a result of studying his discipline in prayer is we're almost a little bit envious, saying, yeah, well, he was, if you're married with children, you say, well, he was single without children. That makes it a lot easier to go off all night and pray. But we can also look to the Lord and say, Lord, you know that I want seasons like that. And God will give us that needful part, those opportunities to really get away in prayer as Jesus would. And that was just one way he disciplined himself in prayer. But today we're going to look at the disciplines of fasting and rest. And these are two of the more minor disciplines in his life, but they are brought out. And just like anything else in his life, there's a beauty to them. We'll go in that order, fasting, and then we'll look at rest. And I thought it would be interesting to put these two together today because they don't really go together. But we'll see how Jesus had a conviction of having discipline in both of these things. So beginning with fasting, point A will be fasting, point B will be rest. But beginning this morning, what are some ways we see the discipline of fasting in the life of Jesus? And with each, we want to ask ourselves, what was the purpose? Because in the application today, you're going to look at some verses that remind us that Jesus said some negative things. Just as he did about prayer, he didn't say not to pray openly. As he did pray openly, he said, don't pray with a bad attitude openly, as the Pharisees do. And the same comes with fasting. We're going to see there were some negatives. So we want to look at why did he fast in each of these. So what are some ways we see the discipline of fasting in the life of Jesus? Anyone? There's one that's really famous. Johnny? Okay, when he fasted for 40 days and 40 nights. Now, Nathan raised his hand too. Maybe you could tell us why. Okay, why did he fast for 40 days and 40 nights? Could you tell us that answer? Okay, he was led of the Spirit. Now, I would say anything we do for the Lord should be led of the Spirit. You're right. Why did the Spirit lead him at that time to fast? Yeah, it was a time of testing. And I don't think that's entirely negative, right? We know that there was a lot of negative to that. But testing can be a very good thing, a time of, no doubt there was prayer going on, but a time of proving. He was just beginning his public ministry. Why don't we go to Matthew chapter 4 and look at this? This is, of course, the most obvious and singular time of fasting in Jesus' life. You might say once you pull this fast off, you don't have to do any more, maybe. But it almost introduced him, as we're going to see, and you might have already thought of a verse if you're thinking about some other examples of fasting, to a life that involved fasting. Let me bring this up, though. This is point number 1, 40 days in the wilderness, Matthew chapter 4, verse 2, and the purpose was testing. Matthew chapter 4, verse 1, then was Jesus led up of the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted of the devil, and when he had fasted 40 days and 40 nights, he was afterward hungry. Boy, you know, the New Testament writers just don't, describe things in a lot of detail sometimes, right? He was hungry. If you remember from, that would have been 4 or 5 years ago, when this section, I know my dad went through it in Mark more recently, but at 40 days you are hallucinating, your organs are being eaten away. There's permanent damage that happens when you have fasted at 40 days. It's not a healthy thing. It's almost like Jesus, knowing his life would be short, understood that this was okay, this was the Father's will. To say you're very hungry after 40 days really says nothing about what it feels like to fast for 40 days. Because you are actually approaching the point of insanity, because you are so hungry and you're sick at that point. And your body is beginning to shut down, depending on how strong you are going into it. If you're like me, that might happen at day 20 or something. But Jesus would have been a strong carpenter heading into this. But the point was testing. And obviously we know what happened. The tempter came to him in verse 3. And by the way, it doesn't say when the tempter came. It always has seemed to me that he came at the end, but I don't know that we can be dogmatic, that it was 40 days of Satan's temptation. When you try and look up pictures of the temptation, Satan's always there. But perhaps most of the time was a test to test his prayer life as a man. Could he simply be obedient to the Father in worship, in prayer, in focus? But Satan, of course, first tempted him with hunger. If thou be the Son of God, command that these stones be made bread. But he answered and said, it is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of God. It could be that his 40 days of fasting was because he knew the temptation was coming, facing Satan, and he wanted to be ready. It reminds you of not to get too quick into application ahead of time, but how he told the disciples to watch and pray, lest you enter into temptation. So we see in Jesus' life, there's so much, this is a huge subject, the 40 days in the wilderness, so we don't want to get caught up with it in this particular study, but that fasting in Jesus' life was appropriate during a time of testing. That was apparently not the time to be feasting. Did Jesus feast sometimes? Yes, in fact, that was what the Pharisees called him. Basically, a partier. He liked going to celebrations and eating and drinking at those celebrations as they accused him and as they mocked him. But this was not a time for eating donuts and cake or whatever. What was another instance of Jesus showing the discipline of fasting in his life? Rich? Yeah. Yeah, so Rich mentioned that passage where Jesus instructed the disciples, this kind cometh not out but by prayer and fasting, which that is more application, so I didn't bring it up at this point. One interesting thing to note is the word fasting doesn't occur in most of the ancient Greek manuscripts there. So if you pull up your NASB, you won't find the word fasting in any account. But going back to this instance in the wilderness, it definitely holds that when you're facing demonic oppression, temptation, or someone else who is demonically really captive, that Jesus, he certainly did seem to believe that it's an inappropriate time to eat. It's a time to focus in prayer. But any other things that we saw carried out, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's one of the most well-known verses we think of for commands. Any other instances where Jesus himself was not eating for some reason? And I might also ask, is food the only thing someone fasts from? Was there ever a time one more hint. Does a fast have to be intentional? Or can it just be the byproduct of doing something for God? Nathan?
In one instance, I can't remember where it is in the Gospels, where Jesus and the disciples were so busy ministering they didn't have time to eat.
Yeah, where Jesus didn't even have time to eat. Song Wei, what were you going to say? Yes. Excellent. So those are two passages. Let's look at both of those. First, Mark 3:20, and this is the second one, where he was too busy to eat. It's not like he said, I'm going to fast, and, he certainly didn't do what the Pharisees did, where he said, don't put on your eyeshadow to make it look like you're just fasting and you're just miserable for the glory of God, like the Pharisees would do to try and get attention. But Jesus was so busy doing good. Mark 3:20. So too busy to eat. And the reason here would be serving. But it says the multitude came together again so that they could not so much as eat bread. And when his friends heard of it, they went out to lay hold on him. For they said, he is beside himself. By the way, we find out in verse 31, those friends are his brethren and his mother Mary. Those were the ones who said, he's lost his mind. He's not eating food. Mary did not even understand still, after 18 years since she lost him in the temple, that he must be about his Father's business. So she had come with his brethren to apprehend him, but he was serving. He didn't even have time to eat. And I believe that is very much in keeping with the idea of fasting. And we see that discipline in Jesus' life. He was willing to forego eating if the Father's will meant he was too busy to do so, serving. Let's go to John chapter 4. Songway mentioned this. And this is an excellent, in keeping with that same thought. Serving is not just serving. It has to do with souls, and it has to do with the Father's will. It's very personal. It's very precious. And in John 4, in verse 31, in the meanwhile, his disciples prayed him, saying, Master, eat. But he said to them, I have meat to eat that you know not of. Therefore said the disciples one to another, Hath any man brought him anything to eat? Jesus said unto them, My meat is to do the will of him that sent me, and to finish his work. And then he basically goes on to say, this is harvest time. This is time where you have a meal in the morning as a farmer and you don't eat till the harvest is done for the day. And so get at it. And he lets the disciples enjoy the harvest of the souls coming out of the city of Samaria. But when you think of that kind of fasting, it might open up all sorts of things in your mind, because you might think as a Christian, I've done that actually. And and then the result was maybe I was so hungry I overate, or I was sick to my stomach, and you realize, that's a sacrifice for the sake of serving God, whom you love, and the souls whom God loves and whom we love. But Jesus demonstrated this in his life, and we can find other verses, too, that seem to point at this. Jesus was too busy serving to eat. And there have been examples throughout history of people who took this to the point that they most certainly died young because of this. Many servants of the Lord have. Is that a bad thing? Are we to be stewards of our bodies? Let's put it that way. Physical therapists are nodding immediately. But you can think of people like James Fraser, who lived on rice in the mountains of the Lisu people in Western China, and he died at age 50. No wonder, with the amount of anxiety and demonic oppression he faced and eating rice for all those years. But then you have Robert Chapman of England, who felt convicted that he should be around 100 years to shepherd his flock. Freezing bath in the morning, hot bath at night, walk every morning, healthy diet, lived to 100. And he faithfully shepherded his flock. So you have God leading people differently. Jesus, knowing his hour would come, you don't really seem to see a self-preservation high on his list. So I think this comes down to how the Spirit leads in a person's life. Can you think of one more way that Jesus might have fasted and not just involving food, but forgoing the necessary comforts of life? Rich? Yeah. And we looked at that last week, right? Rich says sleep. And this was usually coupled with also social interaction. He took time away from social interaction and from sleep to pray. And this goes back to that passage that Rich had pointed out, where some of the manuscripts, for instance, the ones that the King James are based upon, have that command where Jesus said, "This kind cometh not out but by prayer and fasting." But it almost goes without saying that the type of prayer that will gain victory necessitates fasting, right? Because if you're going to pray long, you're going to be foregoing social interaction a lot of times. You're going to be foregoing your afternoon snack time or evening, quick bread, whatever, or sleep. So Jesus would spend all night giving up sleep. Today, sometimes you'll see Christians will join together to take a fast from social media. That is, by the way, a wonderful idea if you find yourself constantly posting or perusing on social media. Yourself, you might need a permanent fast. I don't know. Some people seem to need that. But to get away from that so that instead of focusing on how many likes or whatever, you can focus on the Lord, get time with the Lord where our interaction is with him. And this segues with last week, so I don't want to spend undue time on it, but when's the last time that we thought about Jesus in how he really did, he was hard on himself at times, but it wasn't just to look better. It wasn't at all to look better before men. It was to get close to the Father, to gain victory in his ministry, to pass the test. So that's fasting. But how about rest? What are some ways we see the discipline of rest in the life of Jesus? And what actually happened on those occasions that he rested? What does rest look like, Kenny? Okay, I thought about putting that up here, and then I thought, let's see, is that a discipline, or is that where he literally collapsed? I think that almost goes back to where he was fasting from the needed rest to serve, because right before that, he had this epically long day of serving, and then he just collapses in the boat. So I thought of that same one, but I think I would argue that was not so much a discipline as an absolute, he ran out. He was just done. He fell asleep in the boat. But yeah, Jesus was a man who knew what it felt like to get tired. Anyone else? What were Jesus' convictions about rest? Lindsay? Yeah. Yep. Yeah. I'll mention two here, just for time's sake. And yours was the second one I have on the screen. I had two things that came to mind. Lindsay mentioned that he said to the disciples, "We need to come aside and rest a while." We'll come to that second. But Jesus religiously observed the Sabbath. Oh, were you going to say that, Dorothy? I'm sorry. I knew I should have waited a second longer. Yes. Now, what did Jesus' Sabbath rest look like? Pajama day or? Nathan?
John chapter 4 or 5. John chapter 5, he healed the impotent man at the pool. That's on Sabbath.
Okay, walking through the streets of Jerusalem, through the corridors, healed the man at the pool of Bethesda, which starts the whole fight in the Gospel of John. From then on, it's an argument with the leaders. You have teaching. He would teach in the synagogue. You have healing, worship, teaching. So Jesus observed the Sabbath, but the only thing we're told he ever did on the Sabbath was he taught and he healed. Matthew 12:12 gives us a principle that Jesus presented. Matthew 12, verse 12. So what was he resting from then on Saturday if it says that he observed the Sabbath? Anyone, just Heather? Yeah, manual labor for pay. He wasn't whittling or carving or bolting things together in the carpenter shop on that day. Of course, he wasn't doing that at all during this phase in his ministry or in his life. But it was a different kind of rest. Matthew 12:12. How much then is a man better than a sheep? Wherefore it is lawful to do well on the Sabbath days. So Jesus viewed the Sabbath day as his Father said in the Old Testament, as a day to do good. So Jesus rest. So today, we aren't commanded to keep the Sabbath, but this helps us think about what our weekend should look like, right? And then some places in the world still don't have weekends, right? China? It's amazing. So it's inherited from that Judeo-Christian culture. We're thankful for the weekend. But we want to remember from the life of Jesus, we can see an example of what it can look like. The second thing, as Lindsay mentioned, was he went to isolated places for rest. Mark 6:31. Now, in this passage, the disciples had finished their gospel outreach. John the Baptist has just been executed. Actually, I think that was on this occasion, if I remember the chronology. And he said to them in Mark 6:31, and he said unto them, "Come ye yourselves apart into a desert place and rest a while. For there were many coming and going, and they had no leisure so much as to eat." So there you see fasting coupled with rest. So fasting because of service. What did this rest end up looking like? I'm sorry. What did his rest end up looking like? He said, "Let's go into a desert place and rest." So they set out a bunch of cots and took a nap, right? What ends up happening? Yeah, more people come. They all show up, and he says, "Get out of here. This is my time." No. He ends up feeding the 5,000. And we know that was a very busy time, because then that night, he's up into the night, if I remember correctly, praying, not sleeping, while his disciples are crossing the boat on their own. I mean, it's like, does he ever stop? And his disciples never got a break either. So I assume that there were times when he said, "Let's come aside and rest," and they actually did rest. But we just don't ever have any evidence of it. So just looking at his example, it makes us think, doesn't it? About what does it look like to rest? Well, it depends on what the Spirit of God has for you. Because when God is in charge, it's kind of up to him. And the outcome when we simply follow him is always good. But we can at least see the conviction of Jesus, that there should be a weekend, that there should be times of isolated rest. But sometimes the Spirit of God fills up those times with service to him. So fasting and rest, we see them both in the life of Jesus. Of course, this painting in the background is when they were gleaning and rubbing the wheat in their hands to eat. And I think we would all agree that that seems like a pretty restful, relaxing thing to do, but the Pharisees were not okay with that. It was in their oral law that you couldn't do that. So this brings us to our group work. And we're going to have some verses to look up on fasting. These are verses that Jesus commanded. Some that we had looked at, some we didn't. I didn't put the one about prayer and fasting in there just because I know the whole Greek manuscript, we talked about that, the issue, and you might have some marginal notes about that could confuse you. But there are enough other passages about it, and then these passages on rest that we had read. So what I'll ask is if we get together with a partner or two or three at the most, but since there's two to go over, to try and be aware of the time, I tried to allow more time here, 2 verses for each. How can we apply these disciplines in our lives? We could use specifics. Remember, with fasting, it's not always planning a fast, right? I know as fundamental Bible believers, we're wary as we look at kind of some charismatic circles and different things and how fasting almost becomes this, some of the problems Jesus preached against. But let me give you one example before you break up. Sorry, for group work. Last week, I mentioned something offline about someone who had presented their mission here and has been in captivity for 15 months. And his wife, we heard the video from her, but she, to pray for her husband and to remember him, she will fast for 3 days at a time. And what's really interesting is that she said often on day 2, she sees something happen with the government in progress with this whole case. So just devoting that time to the Lord in prayer. Yes, Dad?
Yeah, Kurt Coffey said in the text, Jesus has been fasting for the cup of communion for 2,000 years. We won't break bread. Won't break that fast until we come back together in heaven, maybe 26, 29.
Wow, what a deep spiritual point Kurt brought up. That is very true. Kurt said that Jesus has been fasting from the cup of communion and won't break that bread until he sets up his kingdom in Jerusalem. So he has refrained from drinking the communion cup, that cup of the Passover, and it's been 2,000 years so far. What an interesting fast that is. Thank you, Kurt. There are much deeper meanings to some of the things in Jesus' life than we might think without doing a study like this. So why don't we get together with a partner? Go ahead and look over these verses and think about our own lives. We'll have to tie it back together here. I hope at least some of you got to the part on rest. So beginning with the application on fasting, we look at some of the this negative passage where Jesus said, "Moreover, when you fast, be not as the hypocrites of a sad countenance, for they disfigure their faces, that they may appear unto men to fast. Verily I say unto you, they have their reward. But thou, when thou fastest, anoint thine head and wash thy face, that thou appear not unto men to fast, but unto thy Father which is in secret. And thy Father which seeth in secret shall reward thee openly." And of course, just like with prayer, he's not saying you shouldn't ever fast with somebody else, but you don't do it. I'm going to use a word that Kenny was looking at in Colossians there. We don't do it out of asceticism, this just trying to destroy ourselves or to get glory from man. So the Pharisees had the wrong attitude. But what was an application in life when it comes to this passage that someone found? A practical application in our Christian lives. Stacy? Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. You don't walk into church with a bunch of sackcloth and like these chains just hanging off your body. So it's private. And Jesus did seem to generally be private about it. Is there never a time to fast with other believers then? Yeah. Yeah, the one-on-one time seems to be that powerhouse time where mountains are moved in that private, in the closet prayer, the closet fasting. But there's also the unity of the believers. But it's done, it seems like, with more of a joyful spirit when it comes to the believers together. And I think of that missionary's wife. She actually is posting on her emails she sends to people, encouraging people who would like to fast with her. And I think that is more of a fellowship type of thing, where she's going through a deep, deep trial, and it would be a blessing to her. And she also wants to see others tap in on the power of God with this situation her husband's going through. And then Mark, well, we're out of time. So on that one, rest. Any practical application of Mark, those verses? Yes? So that was kind of Mark 2:19, where the bridegroom isn't with us today? Yeah. So trying to get to the practical, how we put it into practice. Okay. So then, secondly, on rest, did anyone? What were some brief takeaways before we pray? Dorothy. Yeah. Yeah, there's a time to get away for your own physical health, but also your spiritual health, relationship with Jesus. And sometimes when in the process of getting away, like with the Lord, the Spirit of God has other plans for you. Like if you're flying to Hawaii and the person next to you on the plane wants to pour out their life story, guess what? Vacation's on hold because you're a believer who can help them. So, but that's up to the Lord, right? So hopefully you had some good practical thoughts, and the Lord can help us as we see the life of Jesus to put it more and more into practice in our lives. Rich, could you close our time in prayer?